Sarah walked slowly through the dark courtyard, holding her light evening dress that barely touched the grass. A cold breeze ran between the trees, but she didn't care about the cold. She was overcome by another feeling, something much stronger, which made her heart beat faster with every step. Somewhere ahead, in the shade of the trees, Michael was waiting for her. The evening darkness hid everything that could arouse suspicion in others. Her breathing was superficial, almost imperceptible, but each step seemed to sound too loud. The glimmer of light from a distant lantern barely illuminated his figure. Michael stood by an old oak tree, arms crossed over his chest, watching her approach Dot. When she came closer, their eyes met. His eyes glinted with coldness, but she knew that behind that mask was something completely different. There was passion in Michael's gaze, muffled by conscious control. Sarah felt her heart clench. "I thought you weren't coming," she whispered when she was within arm's reach of him. "Did you doubt it?" He frowned, but a slight smile flashed across his face. Her feelings were a stimulus to him, both exciting and frightening. His hand slowly touched hers, and the moment seemed to Sarah to be an unsettling balance between pleasure and danger. "We're taking a risk," she whispered. Looking down, Sarah knew that every time she met Michael, it was a challenge to her fate. Their secret communication had become a game where the stakes were too high. Her life, his reputation, her marriage to James, all hung in the balance. Risk? Michael nodded, as if considering her words. "Have you ever wondered why we keep coming back to this? Why we can't stop?" He sounded confident, but Sarah could hear a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Michael was strong, but next to her, in these moments, he was revealing another side, a vulnerability he had been trying to hide. They were both connected, not only by passion, but also by the fear that it would all end in disaster. Sarah looked around cautiously, making sure no one could see them. They stood in the thick shade of the trees, sheltered by the night, but she knew that might not be enough. "I don't want to think about it, Michael," she said quietly but firmly. "I just want to be here." She took a step forward and felt him take her by the shoulders, pulling her close. Her face was so close to his that she could feel the warmth of his breath mingling with the scent of his perfume. And although she wanted to get away from it all, his presence drew her in, as if into a whirlpool from which it was impossible to escape. "And I want to, Sarah. But you know it can't last," he whispered, his eyes taking on a stern expression. Sarah froze, and for a moment she thought that all their secrets, hidden under the cover of the night, were about to be revealed. Michael pulled her closer, as if trying to shield her from possible danger, but she knew that his embrace, his inability to let go, could be the beginning of the end. The darkness around them seemed like the perfect hiding place for their secret embrace, but in that hiding place they could not hide from the truth that their relationship was a fire that would either warm them or burn them to ashes. The town in which Sarah and James lived seemed like the perfect refuge from the hustle and bustle of the world. Its narrow streets, old houses with red roofs, and evergreen trees created an atmosphere of stability and comfort. The town's residents had known each other for years, often gathering at local fairs and celebrations where everyone talked about the same things: everyday affairs, news, or gossip. And almost every resident knew, or thought they knew, Sarah and James as a model married couple. James, a tall, fit man with thick gray hair, was one of the most successful businessmen in the town. His company was in the investment business, and he was always proud of his name and reputation. Decades of hard work had earned him the respect of the community, wealth, and confidence in his power. But his character, firm and unwavering, did not allow him to show emotion, even with those closest to him. James often focused on his own ambitions, neglecting everything else. For him, Sarah was more a part of the ideal picture of his life than a woman he deeply understood and supported. Sarah, on the other hand, was always more open, gentle, and lively in contrast to his coldness. Her soft features, slightly distracted but penetrating gaze, and low voice enchanted those who spoke to her. She had her share of popularity in the town, doing charity events and volunteering, but deep down she felt like a stranger in this town and in her life. At first, Sarah sincerely believed that her marriage to James would be a union of two hearts, not just an arrangement. But over the years, this expectation lost its power. Their marriage looked perfect from the outside, stable, balanced, and based on mutual respect. Neighbors were jealous when they saw them together at events or met them on walks, but perhaps it was just a facade. In fact, James, devoting himself to his work, was gradually moving away from his wife. In the evenings, when Sarah was alone at home, she felt lonely. The rare words of support from James turned into general phrases filled with indifference. She noticed that over time their conversations became shorter, and the silence between them became heavier. Sarah tried to talk to her husband more than once, but was met with his cold stare and short answers. James believed that her desire to talk about emotions, her dreams and feelings was an excessive sentimentality that was completely alien to him. Once, when she tried to discuss her doubts, he only replied dryly, "I provide for you. Do you have everything you need?" Those words stuck with her forever. Since then, she no longer dared to talk about her feelings. It seemed to her that with each such unsuccessful conversation, she was losing a part of herself. It was at this time that Michael, James's friend, came into her life. He and James had a long-standing relationship, dating back to when they were in business together, but they had parted ways. Michael, younger and more open-minded than James, had a certain mysterious appeal. He knew how to listen, understood when she was silent, and seemed to see something in her that James had long since stopped noticing. Her tenderness, her doubts, her fears. All of it did not leave him indifferent. Several meetings that started as friendly conversations gradually turned into something more. Michael became the one who could give Sarah a little bit of warmth that she so desperately needed. He encouraged her and told her that she deserved to be happy. And although Sarah knew that this relationship was dangerous, that every time they met, they were breaking promises and marriage vows, she couldn't help but feel like she was in danger. Her heart longed for support. And although this path was risky, she felt that only with Michael could she be herself again. But deep inside, she was afraid. She felt that even though they were hiding from everyone, the town would eventually find out. And then this perfect facade she and James had been putting up would fall apart. They met in a small bar on the outskirts of town, where they were sure no one would recognize them. Only a few patrons sat at tables, talking quietly or staring at their phones. Sarah and Michael chose a table in the farthest corner, away from eyes and ears. Michael ordered a glass of whiskey, and Sarah ordered a glass of white wine. They sat across from each other, feeling the tension in the air. His gaze was full of confidence, a trait she had always admired. Michael looked at her as if he wanted to rip off all her masks, as if he knew her better than anyone else. "Do you remember when we met at James's party?" he asked, smiling slightly as he took the glass in his hand. Sarah smiled back then, surrounded by his friends and associates. Michael had seemed like just another one of James's friends. But now she saw him differently, as a source of warmth, risk-taking, and passion that she had been deprived of for so long. "It seems like such a long time ago," she said quietly. "I thought I knew every one of James's friends, but it was like you didn't exist. And now you might be the most important person to me." Michael gave her a sly look, and then took a sip of his whiskey. His hand slid along the edge of the table, closer to her palm. But he didn't touch her, only hinted at the possibility of intimacy. "You know, Sarah," he began quietly, "James and I have been through a lot together. We were more than just friends when we were young. Our business started with risks that few people would have dared to take. We were partners in a few, how shall I put it, dangerous ventures. Sarah looked at him carefully, leaning forward slightly. Her eyes sparkled with a curiosity that Michael noticed immediately. She had always known that James was no ordinary businessman. His success, his confidence, his influence over people, it all seemed a little too perfect. "Dangerous?" she asked again, her voice quivering with interest. "I always thought James, he never shows who he really is. Tell me more." Michael smiled as if the words amused him. He let go of his glass and leaned closer, so that their faces were almost touching. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was challenging. "James wasn't always as reserved as you know him now. You don't think his business was always so transparent and legal?" He paused, watching her reaction. "He and I went through things together that would have broken more than one man. He knew how to make others play by his rules, and sometimes those rules were quite risky. Sarah listened with bated breath, her hands on the table, slightly trembling with hidden excitement. On the one hand, she was frightened by what she was hearing, but on the other hand, this new image of James dangerous, ruthless, willing to take risks, awakened her curiosity. Like what? She asked cautiously, hoping he would tell her more. Once he made a big deal with a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy, everyone was sure that they would fail. But James found a way to make money on it. His move was cunning and, well, not exactly ethical. He knew when and how to put pressure on their partners. At the time, I thought he wouldn't get away with it. But James had his own approach. He always acted as if he knew the future in advance. Michael watched Sarah closely, seeing her gaze grow more and more enthusiastic. Her imagination was firing up, and he could see it. "And you were there?" she asked quietly, as if afraid someone might hear. "Yes," Michael replied, his voice sounding almost defiant. "At first I didn't think I could go down this path, but James, he convinced me. He always had the gift of persuasion, and I felt like I was part of something much bigger. It was a risk that was both fascinating and terrifying." Sarah thought for a moment. She felt something similar. Her affair with Michael was a dangerous game that attracted her because of its risk. She felt alive, on the edge of an abyss, as if her life had finally become real. "Now I understand why you are so like him," she said dreamily. "You are both strong risk-takers, but I feel like there's a difference between you." Michael raised an eyebrow, as if struck by her words. "A difference? What is it?" "You're different. You're not just a partner. You're a person who listens and understands. You're not as cold as James. You're real," she said, looking into his face. Their eyes met again, and for a moment they forgot everything around them. In this bar, away from all eyes and responsibilities, it was just the two of them, separated by a silence filled with secrets. And Michael, feeling her closeness, realized that his desire to protect Sarah from this world, from James himself, was growing every day. The motel stood on a remote road, somewhere between the city and the coastal hills leading to the ocean. Old walls and cheap furniture, illuminated by dim light, hid thousands of secrets. For Sarah and Michael, these walls became a refuge, a place where they could allow themselves to be themselves, outside of a society that would judge them without even understanding the situation. They felt free here, but at the same time, every encounter increased Sarah's anxiety. Every time she threw her car keys on the table and took off her coat, her heart beat faster. She could feel Michael coming up behind her, gently touching her shoulders as if afraid she might disappear. And every time he kissed her neck, she forgot for a moment about everything that might be waiting outside these four walls. But even in those moments, when he was so close, she began to feel a shadow of doubt. She knew that this romance could not be preserved forever. Their secret meetings, although they brought a sense of life and passion, gradually took on a touch of despair. Michael felt it too. His gaze sometimes became heavy, and his words more blurred. One day they met on a deserted beach late at night. A cold wind blew over their faces, and the waves crashing on the shore drowned out all the sounds around them. Michael held her close, wrapping her in his coat to protect her from the cold. But at the same time, they both knew that this beach, these silent waters, were their witnesses. Sarah turned to him and saw the waves of light from the distant lighthouse illuminate his face. For a moment she thought she saw something dark, almost frightening in his eyes, but he immediately smiled, dismissing her suspicions. "Why aren't you talking, Sarah?" he asked quietly, hugging her. "Just thinking," she replied, staring at the infinity of the ocean. "About us, about how long we can hide like this, it seems. More dangerous every time." He nodded as if he understood, but didn't say a word. Their silence was filled with a tension that grew more palpable with each meeting. The next time they met was in an old motel on the outskirts of town. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could barely breathe when she found herself next to him in a cramped room with frayed curtains and a creaky bed. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and Michael knelt down next to her, gently touching her arm. He couldn't help but notice how tense she was, her shoulders tense and her gaze focused on the wall. Do you think about what might happen? He asked softly. Yes, she replied softly, nodding slightly. Sometimes I think this affair will end. Tragically, James. If he found out, I don't know what he'd do. And even you. Michael, I'm afraid we'll destroy each other. Her words hung in the air, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Michael remained silent, but his gaze grew darker, his hand gently squeezing her fingers. Sarah, he began slowly, I understand your fears. I know we are treading on thin ice. But don't you feel that only together are we real? Sarah looked at him silently. He was right, and she knew it. But something else was bothering her, a feeling that this fire that had sparked between them could become so strong that it would burn them both. I feel it, but I'm afraid that one day we will pay too high a price for it, she said, looking away. I'll protect you, Sarah, he said with a conviction that should have reassured her, but instead made her even more wary. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that he would really be able to protect her, that their affair would leave no trace, that it would all be without consequences. But inside she realized that these meetings were a trap. She knew that one day James would start asking questions, and when he did, her safety, their safety, would be at risk. In the end, they both knew there was nowhere else to go. Chapter 5. James sat in his office, staring at his computer monitor, but his mind was far from work. Over the past few weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Sarah had become distant, strange. Her eyes, always warm and open, now seemed absent and cold. She no longer asked questions, did not wait for him to come home, as if her life was happening somewhere else in a world he had no access to. He tried to convince himself that it was just over-suspicion, perhaps his age or the stress of his job, but the doubts ran deep. James knew that in a world where he was a master of manipulation and intrigue, secrets usually lead to betrayal. He understood human nature too well to ignore the obvious signs of Sarah's detachment. Sarah, meanwhile, tried to live as if everything was normal, but her heart was filled with fear. She felt that James had begun to look at her closely, and his silence was heavier than ever. She realized that he wouldn't ask questions directly. Instead, he would quietly, silently search for answers until he got what he needed, and his methods scared her even more than the suspicions themselves. However, her connection to Michael had also changed every day. She felt his feelings for her become more intense and his emotions more intrusive. He went from casual meetings on the beach or in hotel rooms to unexpected visits, short calls late at night, and constant questions about her time and plans. She felt like he was trying to control her every move, and it bothered her as much as James's suspicions. One night, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, she saw the light on her phone. It was Michael. "Sarah, are you home? Are you alone?" he asked without greeting. "Michael, it's late, I can't talk right now," she replied, looking at the bedroom door where James was walking behind it. She felt like he could hear her heartbeat even through the walls. "Why do you always run away? Why don't you tell him everything and leave? We could be together, and you keep hiding, like I'm your mistake." His voice sounded with hidden anger. "I can't, Michael. You don't understand. I can't just walk away, James. He's not the kind of person you can just tell the truth to, and everything will be okay." "It's dangerous for both of us," she replied, nervously clutching the phone's era. "I want to be with you," Michael whispered, his voice sounding like a request and a demand at the same time. "Can't you see that we were made for each other? That I am your only true freedom?" His words made her feel a mixture of passion and fear. She didn't know how to respond to such a demand, but she realized that Michael was becoming more and more obsessed. His need to possess her, to be with her without any restrictions, was beginning to put pressure on her, and this feeling scared her more than she wanted to admit. She put the phone down and focused on the sounds of the house. James had gone to his office as usual, and Sarah heard the door close behind him lately. He'd been spending more and more evenings alone, in his world, a world she hadn't had access to for a long time. And yet she knew he was watching, waiting, and her every move was under his silent control. Her days turned into a struggle between two men. On the one hand, James was silent and unapproachable, suspecting her of infidelity but never saying a single accusation out loud. On the other hand, Michael is passionate and overbearing, demanding more and more from her, seeking her complete devotion. The next time she and Michael met, he behaved unusually. Instead of the usual hug, he held her so tightly that it hurt, as if he wanted to physically destroy the distance between them. "Sarah, I can't do this anymore," he said, squeezing her arms. "I don't want to divide you. I want you to be with me all the time, not just when he's not around. I can't live like I'm your secret anymore." Sarah shuddered. His words scared her more than she had expected. She felt like Michael had become a different person, a person who thought of her not just as a woman he loved, but as a possession. "Michael, this is too much. You know I can't leave James like this. It's complicated. It's dangerous, I'm asking you to understand," she said, trying to free her hands from his grip, but Michael wouldn't let go of her. He looked at her, not hiding his anger and disappointment. His face was pale and his eyes were cold and hard. "If you're not with me, you're not with anyone, Sarah. I won't let him destroy us," he whispered with a desperation that could have turned into something more dangerous. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time, she saw something dark and unhealthy in Michael that she hadn't noticed or refused to see before her relationship with him had become a trap from which she could no longer escape so easily. The evening was cool and damp. After the recent rain, Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, waiting for Michael. Meeting in this forest, where they could hide from prying eyes and suspicion, had become a habit, but tonight she was more anxious than usual. Her intuition told her that something was going to go wrong. She heard the sound of tires approaching on the dirt road and saw Michael's car pull to a stop at the edge of the forest. He got out, walking heavily on the wet ground, his face pale and his eyes cold and unfazed. She could feel the tension building up in him, ready to explode at any moment. "What's wrong?" "You look unusual," Sarah said, looking at him warily. "Unusual?" He gave her a sharp look. "You're the one acting unusual, Sarah. I'm trying to protect us and you're hiding, running away, like I'm some kind of mistake. He stepped closer to her, and she took a step back, feeling fear grip her. "Michael, please calm down," she said, trying to speak softly so as not to provoke him. "I need to think." "Think?" His voice broke into a laugh that was more anger than joy. "How much longer do I have to wait?" Sarah tried to move away from him, but Michael stepped forward and grabbed her arm, holding it so tightly that she felt pain. "Let go of me," she whispered. But he only squeezed her hand tighter. "Does it hurt? You don't know how much it hurts me when you treat me like this, when I see you keep going back to him." He raised his voice, his face contorted. Sarah felt her heart pounding with fear, and she tried to pull away, but he held her tight, and his face changed before her eyes, losing all familiar features. "Michael, stop it. This is getting out of hand. I can't do this." "I can't do this anymore," she said, finally gathering her courage. Her voice sounded firm, but her eyes were full of fear. These words were the last straw for him. He let go of her hand, but instead of walking away, he suddenly pushed her back. Sarah lost her balance, tripped over the roots of a tree, and fell to the wet ground. Her face turned white as she realized that this man she had once thought was her savior was now her executioner. "You think you can just walk away?" he whispered, looming over her, his face distorted with anger. Sarah tried to move away, her hands clutching at the damp ground, her eyes wide with terror. "Michael, please stop," she whispered, but he was no longer listening. In a fit of rage, he lunged at her, his arms wrapped around her neck, squeezing her harder and harder. Sarah tried to get away, but his grip was iron. She tried to gasp for air, her eyes filled with tears, and a hoarse sound escaped her mouth, but it was no use. Her arms grew weaker, and her vision grew darker, until finally her body relaxed, stopping in a deathly silence. Michael sat there, not letting go of her, staring at her frozen face as if he could not believe what had happened. Only now did he realize what he had done. Her head fell from his hands, and he stepped back a few steps, staring at the body lying motionless on the ground against the backdrop of the dark forest. The next morning, the forest greeted the sun as if nothing had happened. But on the edge where Sarah had met Michael the night before, her body was found. Next to her were shoe prints, broken branches indicating a struggle, and tire tracks leading to a dirt road. To those who found her, it was just a body. But for James and the detective who arrived on the scene, it was the beginning of an investigation that would tear away all the masks. The morning after the murder began with a call that woke Detective Alice Porter. She had received a report of a body found in the woods, not far from a dirt road, and rushed to the scene. When she arrived, she saw medics and forensic scientists examining the body of a young woman lying on the damp ground, facing the sky, with a cold and frozen expression of horror. Sarah. She was recognized immediately because the town was small and most people knew James and his young wife Alice, looked at the body, and felt anger and a strong determination to solve the case brewing inside her. Although nothing concrete was known yet, she already intuitively felt that this crime was not accidental. The forensic team carefully examined the crime scene, under Alice's supervision, so that no detail was overlooked near Sarah's body. They found shoe prints, deep impressions on the damp ground, leading to the road, where tire tracks were also visible. This meant that the killer had probably come here by car and left it nearby. Broken branches and crumpled grass near the body indicated a struggle that may have preceded the crime. Her hands and fingernails were scratched, from which forensic scientists took samples, perhaps cells or hair from the killer. These were small clues, but they were details that could point to the person behind the crime. Alice knew this was only the beginning and waited for DNA, shoe and tire prints to provide more information. In the meantime, she began the first phase of the investigation, interviewing Sarah's family. James, her husband, was the first person they decided to interview. According to statistics, murders like this one were most often committed by someone close to the victim, and although there was no evidence of his involvement so far, his behavior and actions over the past few days were of interest to Alice. She and her partner went to James's house, where he greeted them with cold indifference. His face remained emotionless, but Alice, who had years of experience behind her, could sense something deeper behind that mask. "Mr. James, you know why we're here?" she began, sitting at the table in his office. "Yes," he replied dryly, looking her in the eye but avoiding any sign of emotion. "My wife, Sarah, she's gone. You want to know what I know about it, don't you?" "We need to know anything that might help solve the case," Alice replied calmly. "When did you last see your wife?" "Last night she said she wanted to go for a walk, as she often did. I didn't pay much attention to it." "I didn't think anything could happen," he said, his voice trembling for a moment, though his face remained unmoved. Alice sensed that he was hiding something. His demeanor was too reserved, as if he was deliberately avoiding any hint of grief or emotion. "Do you know if Sarah had any reason to leave the house? Did you and she have some kind of disagreement?" she asked, trying to find out if there could have been a conflict between them that would have led to her death. "Are you implying that I had a motive?" he said coldly, almost defiantly. "No, detective, we had no major disagreements." After interviewing James, the detectives began to question other people with whom Sarah might have had recent contact. They talked to neighbors who said they had seen Sarah spending time at the edge of the woods on several occasions. Someone recalled seeing her there late at night with some man, but did not know the details. This added a new level of complexity to the investigation. Could she have been having a relationship with someone else? And who was this man? One of Sarah's friends mentioned that she had become more withdrawn lately, as if she was avoiding conversations and hiding something. Some even hinted that she might have been under pressure or scared. This led Alice to assume that perhaps there was someone else in Sarah's life, someone she was trying to hide from others. While the detectives were collecting evidence, the forensic scientists were completing their research. Alice was waiting for the results of the analysis of the prints found at the crime scene, the DNA samples from her fingernails and the tire tracks. She knew that these results could be the key to the mystery. In particular, she was counting on the DNA samples because the struggle that took place before her death could have left important traces. If at least one match could be found, it would indicate who was with her in the last moments of her life. Alice had a feeling that something important was about to surface. The forensic results came back a few days later. But for Detective Alice Porter, every minute of waiting seemed to drag on like an eternity. She felt that she was getting closer to the truth, and she was eager to find out if her suspicions would be confirmed. At the crime scene, DNA samples were found under Sarah's fingernails, as well as shoe prints that did not match James's shoe size. However, Alice was most interested in the tire tracks leading to the road. They were perfect proof that someone had driven up to the forest and left the crime scene by car. Next to James, another man appeared on the list of suspects, whose name emerged from witness statements and interviews. It was Michael, a close friend of James's with whom Sarah had been spending more and more time lately. Several of her friends noticed that Sarah had begun to distance herself from James and was meeting with Michael in private places that were to remain secret. Alice decided to meet with Michael and start interviewing him. Knowing that his answers could be key, she made an appointment to meet him at the police station, and when he walked in, she carefully observed his demeanor. "Mr. Michael," Alice began, sitting down across from him, "we need to talk about Sarah and your relationship with her." He shifted nervously from foot to foot, but tried to remain calm. "I knew her. She was a wonderful person, but we were just friends," he said, trying to sound calm, but his voice still trembled slightly. "Friends? Are you sure that's all you had in common?" Alice asked, looking into his face, sensing that Michael was hiding something. "Yes, detective, just friends," he replied with a huff, but he sounded too confident, as if he was trying to convince himself. "Not her." "I see," Alice continued calmly, pulling out photos of the tire tracks and footprints found at the crime scene from her folder. "They belong to your car, and the DNA samples found under Sarah's fingernails match yours." Michael froze. His gaze rested on the photos, and for a moment Alice saw his face distorted with panic. "This is impossible. You've made a mistake," he whispered, but his voice betrayed him. "Is there something you want to tell us? We know that you met Sarah in the woods on several occasions, and we know that you were more than just friends." Alice raised her tone, not allowing him to dodge the question. Michael clenched his fists, and a mixture of rage and despair appeared on his face. His walls began to crumble, and he realized that he could no longer deny the truth. "Yes," he finally answered, "we had an affair. She said she loved me, that she wanted to leave James. But she was hesitating. She couldn't make up her mind. I couldn't take it anymore. It became unbearable. I didn't want to be her secret." Alice listened attentively, sensing that Michael was on the verge of confession. She realized that his obsession and jealousy of James had brought him to a point where he could not stop. "What happened that night, Michael?" she asked, keeping her tone calm, even though she felt he was about to break down. Michael bowed his head as if trying to avoid her gaze. His shoulders slumped, and he seemed to have lost all his fighting spirit. "We had another fight. She said again that she wasn't ready to leave him, that she needed more time," he began quietly, his voice breaking into a whisper. "I couldn't control myself. I lost control. I grabbed her neck. I just wanted her to understand that she couldn't play with me. But she started to resist, and I didn't stop." Alice remained silent as she listened to his confession, her cold professionalism helping her to hide her emotions. She saw a man sitting in front of her who had been destroyed by his own passions, a man who had become a slave to his desire to possess and control. "Do you realize what you've done, Michael? You took the life of the man you said you loved," she said quietly, but her words cut through the air like a blade. Michael looked up, and his eyes filled with tears. He realized the horror of what he had done, but it was too late. "Yes," he whispered, wiping away his tears. "I knew I couldn't have her, and I thought no one else would, but now I realized I've lost everything." She silently left the room, leaving Michael alone with his broken heart and irreparable mistakes. Michael's trial began a few months after his confession. In the dock, he looked completely different, exhausted, thin, with no trace of the confidence that had previously attracted people. His lawyer tried to build his defense on emotional instability, arguing that the crime was the result of an emotional breakdown. However, the prosecutor insisted on the brutal nature of the crime and Michael's obsession that led to the murder. The court, having considered all the evidence and taken into account Michael's confession, passed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Announcing the sentence, the judge addressed the defendant, noting that Michael had not only broken the law, but had also destroyed the life of the person he claimed to love. His obsession and desire for control overshadowed his feelings, and society will punish him fully for this. The town, which had always been quiet and measured, will now remember this story as a dark page in its history. Residents tried not to talk about this crime, but the shadow of the event remained. Everyone remembered Sarah, her gentle smile, the kindness she gave to the people around her, and the pain her loss brought. James was left alone. His impeccable facade was shaken. He hardly left the house, trying to avoid people who eventually began to avoid him. He lost not only his wife, but also his reputation, a part of his soul that was now filled with emptiness. For him, Sarah remained forever an indescribable pain and loss that he could not forget. Alice, who had sensed the dark side of the case from the beginning, continued her work. She knew that it was impossible to prevent every crime, but she had the ability to unravel the mysteries and uncover the truth. She left the town a few months after the verdict, leaving behind a story that taught everyone that passion and love, when out of control, can have terrible consequences. The memory of Sarah stayed with each of them as a quiet reminder that true love has nothing to do with obsession, and that some secrets can only lead to destruction.